Hello chess friends and welcome to Qxc2 Chess channel and welcome back to the Norway Chess tournament in 2021. Today with another great game from the round 2, and we're following now the great Norwegian derby in the Norway Chess tournament. It's of course Magnus Carlsen against Ariantari. So do you know the grip of the tournament? First we have this classical time format game. If the game ends in a draw, then the players have to play an additional Armageddon game, and that's exactly what happened again. Magnus Carlsen and Ariantari played a draw in the classical time format game. It meant that Magnus Carlsen has again the white pieces, but he has now 10 minutes on the clock. Ariantari has only 7 minutes on the clock, but white needs to win the game. If white loses or makes a draw, it's of course a winning game then for black. So we're following now exactly this this Armageddon game. In the first game, in the first classical time format game, in the drawish game, I think Ariantari was much better. Ariantari headed through the whole game a +1 evaluation against Magnus Carlsen. I think Magnus Carlsen pulled off a very important draw because he was dancing on the ropes. I think again in the classical time format game, managed to pull off a draw, which was I think also very cool to see how Magnus then defends the position. Very good game. I think it was also the classical time format game, but now we're following, as I said, this Armageddon game in which the game was I think much better, much more sharper, and with of course more tactical possibilities for both sides. So let's check out now what happened here. Magnus opened now with move e4. We have now e5 by Ariantari, knight to f3, knight to c6, and we have now the Italian game with the move bishop to c4. So here knight to f6, we have now the two knights defense. You can go into the knight attack with knight to g5. It's I think also very popular line. It leads into more dynamic game. Here Magnus Carlsen, of course the great positional player, plays a calm move d3, normal stuff still, and we have now the move bishop to c5, basically the game transposed into the gioco piano of the Italian game. So we have now c3, normal stuff again, with ideas to break through in the center with the move d4, but this move has to be of course first prepared, because as a long-term idea, black could also take here the pawn on e4, so the e4 could be then a weakness in the continuation of the game. So here after move c3, we have now d6 by Ariantari, we have now knight to d2, and now a5. a5 is also a natural idea in Italian games, because b4 is also sometimes an opportunity for white, and even b5 a4 simply creating an expansion on the queen side. So that's why a5 is at least temporarily paralyzing simply the queen side, so it's blocking out the queen side. Now black can play again normal moves. So here in the continuation, we have now an interesting idea by Magnus Carlsen, knight to f1, because it's maybe not the suggested line, it's not such a popular line maybe, but it's I think a great line. First of all, what we can notice in Italian games and in Spanish games, in Spanish opening games, many times you see this idea. So we first castle, then we play something like rook to e1, and then we play knight to f1, knight to g3 with ideas to occupy the weak f5 square. That's many times in Spanish games, as I said. In Italian games, simply the main strategical goal. But playing the game like this, it's of course losing some tempi, because first you play once castling, then you play another time with the rook, and then you in the third move you can play maybe with the knight to f1, knight to g3, so you lose too many tempi. Magnus Carlsen wants now to do the same, but without losing any tempi with the king, which was I think a very important idea here. Knight to f1, it's possible, as I said, although probably the more healthier and more natural move would be probably to be simply kingside castling here by Magnus Carlsen. So here after move knight to f1, here in the continuation bishop to e6, because here Ariantari sensed that of course the center has to be open, because Magnus stays now a little bit longer with the king in the center, so it means now the center has to be opened. And how to open the center, of course, with the move d5, but d5 is not so dangerous immediately, because Magnus still has a good control of this square. So that's why Ariantari is simply preparing this move with the move bishop to e6. So we have now bishop to b5. Magnus doesn't want to trade off the bishops. We have now castling, and now knight to g3, with ideas of course to play as a long-term plan knight to h4 and something like knight to f5. Don't play you have to also consider one tactic. If you play this move knight to h4 too early, then you could risk some tactics, something like knight to e4, and then your knight could be hanging. So you should be always careful when you do this maneuver knight to h4. If the queen is attacking that square, there are maybe some tactical possibilities for your opponent. So here after move knight to g3, we have now I think a passive move here by Ariantari, knight to e7. In my opinion, it was, I think, simply time to break in the center with move d5. Everything was prepared for this move. d5, I think, would be much more aggressive, and I'm not sure why is everyone so scared when they play against Magnus Carlsen. I think they have to break sometimes his position, even if you maybe are not going into a line that you're familiar with. But I think the move d5 would be really a natural move. What Magnus could have done here is maybe bishop to c6. Okay, not a problem. B takes c6, you can take. Knight takes e5, but now here with the move d takes e4, I think black is already a comfortable game. You can maybe take now. Queen to d1 is the opportunity here, and you see now the pieces are simply dancing around white's king. White's king is stuck in the center. So as I said, when your opponent is staying a little bit longer with the king in the center, you have to find, I think, a great way how to open the center. Here in the continuation, as I said, Ardian played the move knight to e7. It's not a move that loses or something for black. It's still a good move. It's a perfect move, but I think with d5 here Ardian could have I think a much more comfortable game in the continuation. So here after move knight to e7, we have now d4 by Magnus. It's actually Magnus that breaks now in the center, which is really wild stuff. If you think about the current Magnus Carlsen's king is in the center, he's breaking in the center with the move d4. Here we have e takes d4, c takes d4, and now bishop to b4. And I think Magnus Carlsen tricked here a little bit Ardian into this attack, because what Magnus did here was really incredible. He played now the move king to f1, and if you could just imagine now this position, it's not the same position, but if you could just imagine in your head, if this position would be a castle position, if the king would be on g1 and the king on the rook on f1, then of course white would have, I think, a brilliant setup. You see, white would have a dominant central position with these two pawns. The knights are on good squares. They can always jump in somehow and attack black's king in the continuation. Bishop very active. This bishop, although hasn't played, is very active, so it's a perfect setup. Of course, the main issue is that Magnus Carlsen hasn't castled so far. So as I said, after move king to f1, still, I think that Magnus Carlsen tricked a little bit Ardian here into this line, because the main issue now after this check is that actually the bishop is trapped. The bishop is trapped with the potential move a3. So in order to create some spaces, you have to somehow retreat with the bishop, and also maybe play something like a5 and then a4 and then bishop to a5. But if you do that, of course, then your pawn on a4 would be hanging. So I think Magnus Carlsen was a little bit sneaky here and tricked Ardian into this check. After move king to f1, I think white has already pleasant game, although the king is not secured by castling, but it's really not such a huge problem anymore, I think, because Ardian didn't challenge Magnus Carlsen in the beginning in the center with this move d5. So here in the continuation we have c6, bishop to d3. You see now Ardian is creating these breathing spaces for the bishop. We have now a3, we have now bishop to b3. Here Ardian hoped, I think, for this move queen to e2, then he can of course retreat and keep his extra pawn here on a4. Pardon me, it's not an extra pawn, but keep simply his pawn on a4. But Magnus Carlsen, of course, is not interested into this in this line. He plays now bishop to c2. We have bishop to c2, queen to c2. Again, the bishop is hanging. You cannot play on c5. So after bishop to f5, now Magnus Carlsen simply grabs the pawn, and it still. It's a good position here for white, although as we said Magnus Carlsen didn't castle, but you cannot break in the center anymore. That's the main issue, I think. Still Magnus Carlsen can of course play something like bishop to e3, rook to d1, because if you try now to break the center with the move d5 like Ardian did, we can pass through simply with the move e5. Even if you try something else, if you try let's see c5, then we simply play d5. We're passing through again, the center gets more and more close. That's the great flexibility of these two connected pawns in the center. So that's why here after move d5, as we said, Magnus simply locks the position, keeps the center close. Now there are no good attacking opportunities, I think, for black, and white is simply continuing the game with an extra pawn. Nothing special, but the pawn can of course win then the endgame in the continuation. So here knight to e4 by Ardian. We have now queen to c2. You don't want to take, of course, knight to e4, then d takes e4. Knight is saying you have to move the knight, and then you have here a weak backward pawn on d4. So that's why not a problem here. Magnus Carlsen played simply queen to c2, challenging further the knight. We have now f5, knight to e2. We have knight to f4, and now bishop to f4. Magnus simply grabs another pawn. Here Ardian again stands some blood. Probably he was thinking probably probably about these ideas on the f file, so that's why he sacrificed another pawn, which wasn't such a bad idea. But I think this bishop is the main issue. It's simply too far away from the action. It of course controls the e1 square, but it's not doing anything else. So the bishop, even if it gets maneuvered here to b6, still it's blocked out here. It's not such an important piece anymore on the board. So great defensive play here also by Magnus Carlsen, we have to say it, although the king is in the center on f1, but the king cannot be really attacked here. So we have near knight to g6, bishop to e3, simply retreating, knight to h4. We have now knight to g3, attacking also again the knight on e4 here. In the continuation, we have now knight to f3, g takes f3, and now bishop to knight to g5, and now simply f4, fixing everything. Although this bishop is a little bit blocked out now by its own pawns, but this pawn storm that Magnus is creating now, you see now Magnus has here a 4 versus 2 situation on the king side. These pawns are mobile, these pawns are marching. So as I said, it's something went wrong here already for Ariantari. So here again, knight to f3. Actually, the knight is even locked here because h4, Magnus is paralyzing simply the knight further in the continuation of the game. We have now c5, we have king to g2, knight to d4, we have bishop to d4, c takes d4. Okay, here Ariantari got the pawn back, but it's not such a huge problem. These are double pawns, they are not so mobile, they're basically also weaknesses in the continuation. And now Magnus plays a brilliant move, of course, f5, connects his pawns on the 5th rank, and basically this is a completely winning endgame here for Magnus Carlsen, because you cannot really attack in a good way this pawn. So you can maybe include this bishop into the game, but as I said, these pawns can be supported. We can play here decent blockade with the move queen to d3, f4 is even a possibility, creating these 3 mobile pawns together. They will roll on, and as I said, simply a bad position here for black. So queen to e8, played by Ariantari. We have now b4, bishop to b6, rook to e1, protecting of course the pawn on e5. We have rook to c8, queen to b3, creating also some tactical threats here on this long diagonal. We have rook to c4, and now queen to f3. We have queen to c6, and now f6. Very nice move, because here if you try something like g takes f6, it's not such a huge problem, because you get simply e6. This mobility of this pawn is simply too much to handle. You have to play in one moment, I think, sort of a blockade, but now knight to h5 is coming, and you see you lose simply the tactical battle around the square f6. I've analyzed one line, really wild line. If you try even to take, then here queen to g4 is possible. You have to protect your rook, but now here queen to g7, you have to move, and then after rook takes e6, queen to h6, and now rook to e1 is very interesting, really nice tactic, deflecting the queen from the defense of the king. If you take, of course, here queen to e1, then you get knight to f6, and you get checkmated here with queen to d7. This would be a possible continuation. So as I said, g takes f6 is not so good because of this potential mobility and dynamics of this e-pawn. Really wild stuff. So here after move the queen to e6, Magnus Carlsen centralized the knight on a very active square. We have now g6, we have knight to e7 the check, king to h8, knight takes d5, Magnus grabs another pawn. As we said, these were really weaknesses, although 2 pawns, but the double pawns are always weaknesses. So here after move queen to d5, we have d3, knight to b6, here rook to g4, because if you take queen to b6, nothing dramatically changes. Here e6 is simply too much to handle. 2 connected pawns on the 6th rank is actually a losing game. The rook cannot hold anymore the position, the rook is helpless here. You could maybe try d2, but not a problem. We can here from white's perspective also play the move e7. Even if you try a tricky stuff with maybe promotion of the knight, we can simply take, and then if you try c8, here simply pushing the pawns here even on e8, or you can play here f7, f8, whatever you do, black is simply lost. So here after move knight to b6, as said, queen to b6 is not working, as the evaluation is already +8 here for white. Here in the continuation we have rook to g4, king to f1, we have d2. Here Magnus plays a rook lift, rook to e3. He wants of course to have a great protection of his 3rd rank. We have now rook to d4, and now rook to d1 takes, and simply again creating these 2 connected pass pawns here. We have queen to b5 check, rook to e2 covering everything. We have rook to d3, but now again e7. It's a beautiful queen sacrifice. It's if you take, of course, then you get checkmated with a promotion here, and it would be game over. So that's why after move e7 we have a rook to e8, we have queen to e4, queen to d7 by Ariantari. Now again f7, check, not a problem. And here after move king to g1 in this position, Ariantari resigned. You could try maybe here rook to g3, but it's not a problem. We can cover, and now after queen to g2, queen takes g2, king to g2, and there's nothing that can be done. It would be checkmate in 4. So really beautiful game. Interesting ideas of here played by Magnus Carlsen with this delaying castling idea. You see, when you have a good central control like this, it is possible to stay a little bit longer with your king in the center. But in one particular moment, I think Ariantari should have played more aggressively, should have simply pushed the pawn on d5, tried to play an open game. What happens, it's not a problem. But with this seemingly good move, knight to e7, I think the game book became more and more positional, and Magnus then found, I think, a good setup, centralized his pieces, get the knight on f3, knight on g3, bishops were very active, had these two connected pawns in the center. So good setup, but as I said, and managed to get out with the king in an easy way. Magnus Carlsen got never challenged, I think, by Ariantari in the game. So as I said, it was a deserved win. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I really enjoyed it a lot. If you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my coverage so far with some two great games that we have analyzed before. And if you want to see maybe some great games played by top engines, check out my commented chess games, the best chess games played by engines, with some great games played by Stockfish, Alpha Zero, Lila Zero, and many more. Here's the link of our whole playlist. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.